look at this on the YouTube channel. So I put it on my YouTube channel showing how it was burned. What we did is we lit a burn, kind of a back burn that burned into the wind, and then lit a head fire that burned kind of towards that back burn, hopefully allowing any animals to kind of escape towards the wind. But by and large, when you look at a plot like this, you're going to see a plot that had a lot of carbon last year. So there's a lot of carbon that was tied up in the above ground biomass. So the above ground biomass had a ton of carbon last year. We burned that went into the atmosphere. All the root systems below are perennial. So these are perennial root systems. So if you have perennial root systems, there's allocating carbon every year. So every year carbon is being built up below basically below the surface of the ground. And we have forbs, a lot of forbs, a lot of grasses. Typically the forbs, there's some remaining pieces of forbs, but these were the tall, really tall stems of silphiums, so mostly compass plants. There's 4 different types of silphiums that we find in this prairie, and they're all in the family, the aster family. So they're a fairly showy flower that you see later in the growing season. We also have a lot of grasses. So predominantly these sites are dominated by grasses. In fact, the Avis prairie across the way is predominated by grasses because we burn it every spring. So when you burn it every spring, what's going to happen is you're going to actually make it more favorable for the grasses. Because what happens is you get a lot of this ash, you can see the ash and kind of black surface of the soil, and it heats up a lot sooner. So if it heats up a lot sooner, what's going to happen is it's really going to favor those C4 grasses. And those C4 grasses need a pretty warm. So every year when we burn this, so every year that we're burning this prairie, we're initiating the process of secondary succession. So secondary succession implies that there's still seeds, there's still soil, there's still roots in that, basically in that ecological system. Primary succession, on the other hand, we talked about this in an earlier lecture. Primary succession is based upon the fact that there's no real good soil. So you're dealing just with parent material. It might be a flow of ash out of a volcano. When the glaciers receded from Indiana, as they receded back to the north, they left behind sterile parent material. And that sterile parent material basically over time became seeded in by annual plants. And then you got perennial shrubs and vines and trees, and eventually so Indiana, when the glaciers receded off of the face of this part of the state, it was first and foremost kind of a sedge meadow. And then spruce trees came in, and then after the spruce left, it was mostly a hardwood forest like we see today. So whole ecological systems were pushed to the south during that event. But that's primary succession. This is secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs every year when you burn it. When a farmer goes out in his farm field and he tills the landscape, he's tilling that soil each year, initiating the process of secondary succession. And secondary succession will take place in a much faster rate of time than primary succession. Now that makes sense, because primary succession you start from bare rock or sterile material, whereas secondary succession you're starting predominantly from soil. And there's typically a soil, there's seeds in the soil. In this case, there's basically a lot of roots in the soil. So these plants are all cryptophytes. So their perennial buds are near or below the surface of the soil. They're mostly seed grasses, a lot of forbs. So the forbs are principally what you find in the latter part of the summer. The asters, you can see the blooms, they're mostly yellow in nature. So we've got C4 grasses, as I mentioned, things like blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass. Those are very common within this prairie. And this is actually a prairie, basically a prairie restoration. So what we've done is we've taken a plot of land, and back in the early 1990s, they plowed this up, planted the seeds, and then the only real management technique we use is fire. So every year we come in and burn it. That's the management technique. It's never mown, it's never herbicided. It's just kind of left its own devices. And each year, more and more carbon is being sent below ground. So this actually acts as a carbon sink. So carbon from the atmosphere is continually moving into the soil in this setting. So this is a process, as I mentioned, secondary succession, but this is a prairie restoration. It's not a remnant prairie. So remnant prairies are prairies that are left behind that have never been disturbed. So in the western part of the state, there's a few remnant prairies and cemeteries along old railroad right-of-ways, but they haven't been planted, they haven't been tended. They've just been left alone and disturbed just enough that you don't get the overtopping by vegetation. And eventually, if we didn't do any burning here, if we left this totally alone, what's going to happen is in another 5 or 10 years, you're going to see there's woody plants that are growing in here. So there'd be woody plants, and it would look eventually like what we're seeing in the background. So in the background, it's mostly dogwood, a lot of shade intolerant species growing in that location. So this is a restoration plot. The tallgrass prairie never really made it this far east. There was some indications during the hypsothermal, or about 4000 BC. It was a little drier here. There might have been prairies as far eastward as Ohio. But in the 1800s or the 1700s, when early settlers came through, there were basically no prairies in this part of Indiana. It was one giant forest. So the tallgrass systems that we've talked about are actually found further to the west. So western Indiana, eastern Illinois, all the way through northern Missouri and Iowa. So the tallgrass systems were there. Mixed grass systems were a little further to the west, in the Dakotas, and the shortgrass systems were just off the east side or the east flanks of the Rocky Mountains. So that kind of takes you through the major biomes that we're seeing through here. We just finished, or at least I just finished, recording a lecture series on some of the major biomes. Chapter 23 in your textbook has several major biomes. Indiana's in the eastern deciduous forest biome. Right here, what we've done is we've created a little restoration plot, and we restored a prairie here. But the prairies were never here. I hope that's pretty self-evident. So the kind of theme of today is going to be the process of secondary succession. So what happens to the landscape after a disturbance? So every year we disturb this location. So we introduce fire to this location every year. But if you don't disturb a system, how many years does it take for this area to actually succeed back to a forest? And that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at plots that are ages 1 through 5 years of age. And then there's another couple plots. One is about 15, 20 years of age. One's about 25 years of age. And then we'll walk into the forest. And the forest has examples. The trees in the overstory might be 2 foot in diameter. They're probably close to 120, 130 years of age. But the understory was heavily disturbed up until about the 1960s. So the 1960s, they had fenced that whole area behind the building in, and they were running cattle through. And those cattle would eat the seedlings, they'll eat the herbaceous material, they eat a lot of the plants within that system. So we're going to end the video right here. So we're going to end it, and then we're going to look at the plots. Okay, now we're going to be looking at actually 5 different plots that we know the exact age of these plots. So this plot was actually tilled last year and had one growing season. So what I did is I came out here in May, the first week of May, used herbicide, burned everything down, and tilled it up. So when I tilled this landscape, I didn't plant anything. So everything you see behind you actually grew in one growing season. So all these plants, especially these small annual plants, you've got, this is Soteria faberi, or essentially giant foxtail grass. We also have ragweed. So ragweed is a very common annual. So all of these plants grew very quickly last year. And this whole carpet of plants, the seeds were in the soil. So the soil has these seeds just resident, almost like a bank. So you have a bank of seeds that are in the soil, And those bank of seeds will sprout up during the growing season. So during the growing season, you have rapid growth of these annual plants. And you might think of these plants as being somewhat of like podunk plants. They're little piddly plants, they live 1 year. They don't have much in terms of biomass. However, their seeds could live for decades. And a few years ago, I was up in Chicago, and I was at essentially a Chicago White Sox baseball game. And underneath the sidewalk, they'd ripped up a sidewalk, and they'd taken the sidewalk away. There was a carpet of these types of weeds. So for years and years and years, where the environmental science building is at, this was all farmed. So each year, these are the farm weeds. These are the weeds that farmers are always trying to get out of their fields. Things like ragweed, things like foxtail grass. They compete with the soybeans, they compete with the corn. And they use herbicides, specifically glyphosate, which is Roundup, to burn these things down. So when they plant, before they plant, they'll typically burn the weeds down. And even after they plant, they're going to go through and basically spray over the tops of the soybeans and the corn, which are not susceptible to Roundup, and kill the weeds below. So these are annual plant species. So year one, basically what you're seeing out here is mostly annuals. So you have mostly annual plant species. But back in the 1800s, the early 1800s, when early settlers came into the southwestern United States, they actually encountered a lot of annual plant seeds in baskets and jars in Hopewell dwellings. And there are things like bean seeds and pea seeds and squash seeds. And some of them were even viable. So they took the seeds that were several hundred years old, that were stored away in these containers, and some of the early gardens were used, they used those seeds for their early gardens. So this is year one. So typically after year one, you mostly have annual plants. There are, along the edge, there's a few biennials. This is a biennial called wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace. So this is an annual that, not an annual, but a biennial that takes 2 years to kind of get going. So the first year it grows on the ground, and a little tiny bit on the ground. You can barely see it here. Here's some right here. But on the ground, this is the first growing year of the wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace, which is a biennial. So this next year, this will be the second growing season. During the second growing season, you're going to see a lot of that. Let's go to the plot year number 2. And this plot, if you look at it closely, there's still a lot of annuals. So there's still some Soteria, some foxtail grass that's growing here. There's still stalks, I think, from the common ragweed out here as well. But if you look out across here, you see a mustard that's a biennial. So in year 2, principally what you're going to find are mostly biennials. And this one's called Yellow Rocket. So it's a type of mustard. And this year's been very cool. The spring's been very cool. So it's been very conducive to the growth of this mustard. So in year 2, you have mostly biennials. Let's look at year 3. Let's go to year 3. And year 3 plot is right here. And don't pay attention too much to the boundaries because I didn't really plow those too good. And this is a woody plant species that you typically see after about year 4 or 5. So if you walk into this plot, most of what we're seeing is going to be, we're starting to see some perennial plants. This is a gray-headed coneflower, which seeded in from the prairie plot. But you also start to see a lot of grasses starting. So in the understory here, we're starting to see some after year number 3, we're starting to see some Kentucky bluegrass. We're still getting, though, there's still quite a bit of gray coneflower. There's still quite a bit of the Daucus carota or the Queen Anne's lace in here as well. So let's go to year number 4. this is plot year number 4. Okay, so in year number 4, we're starting to get more and more perennial plants. This is a perennial plant. This is an aster. Okay, it's a perennial plant. We also have some, looks like here's some thistles. So thistles are biennials. So you have a thistle. This is a field thistle after year 4. Let's go into year 5. Year 5 over here. Year 5 is mostly, if you look at the understory, it's mostly going to be grass. And then these wide leaf plants, this guy's right here, that's solidago. So this is solidago altissima, or tall goldenrod. And tall goldenrod, we had a lab on it earlier in the semester when we looked at the goldenrod gallflies. But this is a perennial plant. So there's another clump of it right over here. But these perennial plants will live for about 15 to 20 years. So 15 to 20 years, these will actually occupy this site. So if you did nothing to this site, it'd be a patch, a monotypic patch of goldenrod. And in the fall of the year, you know, plot number 5, or the 5th year plot, is typically going to be just a sea of goldenrod, basically. Also, we've got another plant over here, which is a walnut tree. So we've got Juglans nigra, which is walnut, okay? And that walnut tree came from the parent trees along the back edge. So there's a parent, well, you can see all the parent trees back behind us. So some enterprising squirrel carried a nut all the way over here and basically buried it. And he didn't get eaten before he came here by a red-tailed hawk. So he survived the trip. But, you know, if you left this plot alone in another 20 years, it's going to look like basically a woody, kind of a woody snarl. So you're going to have vines and shrubs. You'll have a lot of trees as well. And then over about 25 years, some of those trees might be 30 feet tall. And we'll see a plot that's about 20 years of age, and we'll see one that's between 25 and 30 years of age next. But if you take a look out across these plots once again, you know, you got the year number 1 is over here, the very first year. And most of what you find in year number 1 is annual. And then if you pan over to the other side, you can see that far plot was plot number 2, or plot year 2, and then we worked our way to the 3rd year, 4th year, and this latest one is year number 5. So hopefully that kind of clears up the questions you might have regarding secondary succession in eastern Indiana, or through much of the Midwest. So much of the Midwest, if you tilled up your backyard, within 5 years, you're going to have trees growing, or shrubs or vines or something like that, you know, woody plants. And these are the plants that really need a lot of sunlight. So a walnut tree, a white ash tree, a hawthorn tree, they need full sunlight. They're shade intolerant. So we're going to take a little foray back into a plot that's about 20 years of age. Okay, now we're looking at a plot that's about 20 years of age. So if you did nothing to the landscape, over 20 years, this is what it would look like. So we have a lot of light, shade intolerant species. They need full sunlight. One of the first vines to kind of sprout up here, or actually produce leaves, okay, this is going to be, if you look at it closely, it's multiflora rose. So Rosa multiflora. It was actually planted back in the 1950s, basically for wildlife food. Unfortunately, it goes everywhere. It's very difficult to walk through. What the birds will eat are actually these hips, these rose hips. So they'll eat the hips and then spread the berries everywhere. So we know basically birds will, before they take off, kind of lighten the load and defecate and effectively plant berries underneath the tree that they take off from. And actually behind us, you can see this is an old fence row. So this is an old fence row where birds would land on the fence. They would basically lighten the load, take off, and effectively plant a lot of what you see back along that fence line. We also have another plant that's super shade intolerant. So this is a dogwood, gray dogwood. It grows out through here. You can see there's quite a few of it right here. Some more gray dogwood. There's another plant. This one is a hawthorn. So this is downy hawthorn. And downy hawthorn is once again one of these shade intolerant species. It needs full sunlight. So it's a species you find in these old fields. We're also seeing, if you look at this closely, there's a lot of goldenrod here. So these are all goldenrod that are growing, and they'll grow here for 15 or 20 years. This piece of property is about 20 years ago, they stopped mowing it here. So over a period of 20 years, the seeds, mostly from the forest, have seeded out into this area. We also have some trees that are growing. This tree here has opposite branching, so this is an ash, this is white ash. And this is a tree that actually, over time, this tree disappears from the landscape because of the emerald ash borer. So the emerald ash borer does a number on the white ash. There's a white ash here, there's another white ash tree right here. Another white ash. Hawthorn. So all these species are light-loving species. They need full sunlight. And then further behind me we have more ash trees. A lot of ash trees here. A lot of gray dogwood. The understory, or not the understory, but most of the herbaceous material is going to be the solidago, or the goldenrod. So the solidago holds the site pretty well. In fact, it actually produces phenolic compounds in its roots and its stems and its leaves that somewhat inhibits the growth of other plants. So it's kind of like one of these early invaders that it'll lay the chemicals down and it'll inhibit the growth of other species around it. So it's very clonal, it's very much a very competitive plant. So this is once again, the solidago. If we walk back here a little further, get through all these briars, you can see there's a lot more of this gray dogwood. This is all gray dogwood through here, a lot of gray dogwood. There's some more of the multiflora rose, so Rosa multiflora, very common. So after about 20 years, this is what you get. Let's kind of walk out this direction. Walk this way. And there's a few more plants out here. These are mostly going to be the white ash. So we have white ash growing here, another white ash tree. We also have a tree it's not the greatest tree to have. This is actually a tree called autumn olive or Russian olive. So it's a tree that was planted quite frequently for wildlife habitat, even for windbreaks along interstate highways. So they'd plant this to prevent basically snowdrifts from hitting the highway. They plant rows and rows of this stuff, but unfortunately birds love it, and they effectively plant it everywhere. And the only way really to get rid of this stuff is cut it off at the base and treat it with herbicide. So if you have a small piece of property, especially in Indiana, you're going to be facing a lot of this autumn olive. There's a huge amount of autumn olive that's found, and then also bush honeysuckle. So both of those species are quite common in secondary succession. So we'll end it here, and then we'll see a spot that's about 25 to 30 years of age. Okay, now we're looking at a plot of land that was established, or at least the trees that we find on it in the herbaceous material in the understory was established about 25 to 30 years ago. So after 30 years, this is what the landscape of Indiana would look like if you didn't mow your backyard, or you didn't plow that agricultural field. It comes back rather quickly. Right here we've got a light-loving black walnut tree, and the vine that's growing on it is also light-loving, and that is poison ivy. So poison ivy, wild grapes, they all grow up with the tree. So they grow up with the canopy. They're all shade intolerant. It's not like Jack and the Beanstalk. Okay, the plant, the vine doesn't start at the base of the tree and go up with the tree. Go up the tree. It grows up with the tree through time. We still have a lot of the dogwood. So the gray dogwood's present out here. Here's some more black walnut, and then also the poison ivy along it as well. And then we have a large oak tree. That's a northern red oak, this big tall tree behind us. Let's walk out here a bit. We also have another oak. This is white oak, Quercus alba. So Quercus alba and white oak. A couple more of the black walnuts. So a couple more black walnut trees. Okay. And then finally on the understory, we're still seeing a lot of this gray dogwood. So a lot of gray dogwood. And then if you look at the grass is mostly Kentucky bluegrass. So when they purchased this property, Dr. Paul Rothrock and Dr. Dick Squires, who were the kind of the managers of this property at that time, there was heavy amounts of erosion across this field. So what they did is they planted it predominantly to the Kentucky bluegrass, and that helped maintain the soil in place. And a lot of those annual plants, like the annual plants we talked about earlier, things like giant foxtail grass, common ragweed, they kind of act like God's Band-Aid. So you tear up the land, and almost immediately those seeds sprout. And they hold the soil for only 1 year. But the nice thing about Kentucky bluegrass is it's a perennial. So it keeps growing. So they seeded this about 35 years ago, and it's still here. Unfortunately, it's kind of slowed the process of secondary succession, because if the soil would have been bare, it would have been easier for the seeds from the forest to make its way onto this landscape. However, the amount of soil erosion was pretty significant at that time, so they made the call, and I think rightly so, to kind of sow it down first with grass to hold the soil in place. So if this grass was not here, if they didn't plant this grass, there had probably been the trees have been a lot taller. So we've been looking at trees that are, some of these trees are 30 foot high. If you look at these trees, they're a good 30 foot high, if not higher. So let's walk out here a little bit further. So once again, we're finding black walnuts out here. Still solid dago after 30 years. Solid dago, the goldenrod. Still a lot of the gray dogwood out here. There's one other tree I want to show you. And this is a tree that's quite commonly found in kind of early successional stages. If you've driven your car down to Cincinnati, Ohio, or you've driven through Kentucky, you've probably seen this. This tree is Eastern red cedar. It needs full sunlight, and deer love it. So from here on down, you can see where over the years that deer have kind of munched on it versus the rest of the tree. In some cases, they'll actually rub their antlers vigorously on these things. They'll actually kill them in some cases. So this is another tree that you find out in these early successional plots. One other tree I want to show you over here before we go into the forest. And it's this guy right here. Okay, this is a honey locust. If you look at the stem of the honey locust, huge amounts of thorns. So those thorns almost look like the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. I mean, they're pretty substantial. But this is once again another light-loving species. So it's very shade intolerant. It's also a legume. So these legumes, honey locust doesn't fix a lot of nitrogen, but there's other legumes, leguminous trees like black locust, that fixes a lot of nitrogen below the ground. And you can tell that these types of organisms have evolved in high herbivory environments. So these trees look very similar to what you'd find in places like the Serengeti and some of the woodlands in northern Africa. So I think we'll end it there. After 30 years, this is what we're seeing. Let's get started. We're now in the woodlot section of the Arboretum. And for the most part, this plot has been undisturbed since the 1960s. So a better part of, about 60 years, this has not been disturbed. So the overstory trees, the trees that we see in the overstory, things like the black walnut tree right here. The black walnut tree, There's a dead, over here we have a dead ash tree. And this is American, basically the American ash, or the white ash. We have that in the overstory, but it's dead. We also have, this is a hickory. It's called pignut hickory. So it's a very shade-loving, shade-intolerant species, so it needs full sunlight. We also have over here another pignut hickory. Okay, let's walk this direction a little ways. This is a large oak tree. This is chinkapin oak. So it's Quercus muhlenbergii. We saw oaks out in the old field. So after 30 years, you find them in an old field, but you also find them in the forest. So the overstory, all the overstory that we're looking at right here, it's all very shade intolerant. So they need full sunlight. Heck, behind this tree we have another. This is an oak species. It's called Quercus rubra, or red oak. An easy way to remember this guy is it looks like ski track bark. So it looks like somebody's taken a pair of skis and gone up and down the bark of this specimen. So another light-loving species. Walk this direction. There's a really interesting tree here. This one is shagbark hickory. So shagbark hickory, once again, is another light-loving species. So it's a shagbark hickory. There's several of these that were growing out in that 25 to 30-year-old field. I didn't point them out. I must have missed those. I'm sorry about that. But these are shade-intolerant species. If you look at the understory is different though. The understory is all going to be very small and very devoid of branches low down. So this understory, most of these trees are sugar maple. So these are like the little trees that could, or the little engine that could. They slowly grow in the understory. They grow super slow. This tree here is probably older than I am. So I'd imagine this tree might be 60 years of age. And it just sits here and it waits. It waits for one of these larger trees to die off, or the emerald ash borer to kill a few ash trees around it, and then the light opens up. The canopy opens up. Once the canopy opens up, they grow fairly quickly. There's a house on Berry Street, the first house I built in town, where I went into this forest and grabbed a bunch of them about waist high. I pruned them in the fall of the year, and in the spring I transplanted them into the front yard of the house there. And some of those are now 35 feet tall. And they were planted in like 90, 97, 97, 98, maybe 99, that time frame. So the better part of, 30 years, they're 35, 40 foot tall. So they're really slow growing. They're, in terms of a wood quality, they're a nice wood. I mean, if you use it for woodworking, it's a very, very hard, very durable wood. You can make things like knife handles out of it. Even hardwood floors are made out of maple in some cases. But most hardwood floors are principally made out of oak. So white oak and red oak are some of the major species used for wood flooring. Shagbark hickory, on the other hand, shagbark hickory is used for things like axe handles and hammer handles. And I even had some cabinets that were made out of this years ago. It's a real durable, really hard wood, and it grows pretty quickly. So everything in the canopy, all these trees we see in the canopy, they'll grow 2-3 foot a year under good site conditions. The stuff in the understory, most of it is shade tolerant. So we have basically just mostly sugar maple growing in the understory. Let's walk this direction. Maybe I can find one or two other things. Here's a tree that grows in the understory. That is the first tree to actually leaf out in the spring. And it's not shade tolerant. It's actually a shade intolerant species. So what it does is it will actually gather the photosynthesis or the sunlight while it can. So it grows quickly early in the year, and then once the canopy leaves out, it doesn't do anything. It just kind of sits there and waits. And in fact, it drops its leaves in the middle part of August. So this is the Ohio buckeye. We'll talk more about this. I'm going to take you on a forestry tour in maybe a week or two. So we'll go through the forest, and I'll talk about the forest in general. But right now we're talking about in the context of secondary succession. So after 60 years of no disturbance, this is what a forest would look like. However, a lot of this overstory is about 100, maybe 120 years of age. So most of the overstory trees that we're seeing are about 120 years of age, and the understory that's grown in is grown in after they removed the cattle off this landscape. So after the disturbance was no longer occurring. One other thing I want to talk about is, if you look at these systems, if you look at these ecological systems, is if you look at the forest floor, eventually this forest floor will be in full bloom. So in another couple of weeks, there'll be a huge number of flowers growing out here. And after about 3 or 4 more weeks, will have flowered and produced all their seeds. So their seeds would all be produced, and the seeds will be carried around by ants, other types of insects, and planted throughout the understory. And a lot of these guys are cryptophytes, so a lot of them actually retain their root systems year after year after year. We'll talk more about that in our forestry tour. And I'm going to end today talking about open and closed systems. So we spent a lot of time in this course talking about the flow of matter and energy through ecological systems. In a forest, there's a lot of internal recycling. So these leaves that hit the ground in October and November, as they started to decompose last fall, the roots of the trees were actually growing vigorously. So in the fall of the year is typically when you get majority of the root growth. And those roots are intercepting the minerals that are coming out of that decomposition. So as the microbes chew up these leaves, they're using the leaves as an energy source, and they're releasing nitrogen, they're releasing phosphorus, they're releasing calcium, they're releasing sulfur back into the soil. And then the trees are taking that back in. So it's a somewhat of a closed system. So the system's somewhat closed. So there's not a lot of nutrient loss out of this system. So going from year 1 to year 5 to year 20 to year 30, and then to a forest that has not been disturbed for 60 years, and the overstory is probably 120, 125 years of age. This is going to be the most closed system of all of those places that we've stopped so far. There's more internal recycling here than there would be out on those other plots. On an ag field, a lot of this stuff just washes off the field. So in an ag setting, you lose herbicide, you lose the pesticides, you lose the fertilizers, you lose the soil. All that washes into the ditches. And then those ditches enter into the Mississippi River. And once it's in the Mississippi River, it's taken off the site. So that should make a little bit of sense. And hopefully you've gained a little bit of understanding today of secondary succession and what Indiana, at least this part of Indiana, would look like if you didn't disturb it for 120 years. This is what you get. Michigan, the same thing in Michigan, northern Michigan, or southern Michigan, northern Ohio, northern Illinois, very similar types of ecological systems. Okay?